Our sponsor today is GLSA. For those non-members who may be dropping in on the call today, GLSA, or Group Legal Services Association, is an affiliate of the American Bar Association, is a professional membership representing the legal services plan industry and provider attorneys. And joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. Check it out at glsaonline.org. Okay, my name is Tom Martin. I'll be your host today. Our teleconference today is Diversity and Gender Bias in the Legal Profession. I'm very excited to introduce you to today's guest. I actually first met Gina at the first TBD Law Conference in St. Louis, and let me tell you a little bit about her. She's the co-author of The Anxious Lawyer. It's an 8-week guide to joyful and satisfying law practice through mindfulness and meditation. She's been interviewed on MSNBC and Wall Street Journal. She is also a regular contributor to Forbes, Bloomberg, Lawyerist, and Huffington Post, where she covers resilience, work-life integration, wellness in the workplace, and she regularly speaks on women's issues, diversity, wellness, productivity, mindfulness, and meditation. So Gina, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show. It sounds like you're extremely busy. I don't know how you balance it all. You do speak about work-life balance, and it sounds like a heck of a lot to do. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
And I understand you're in San Francisco today. How's it going? Is it overcast? Staying cool?
No, it's a beautiful day. It's very typical San Francisco 70-something degree weather.
Well, that's great. I know that in some other parts of the country, it's been quite wet or blistering. It's sort of extremes right now.
Yeah.
But again, I want to thank you for making time for us this morning. I've heard such great things about you, and I've also read for myself, and I really appreciate the viewpoint that you bring to our industry, because as you know, many lawyers are very job intensive, and we work, and sometimes we work too much. And so I greatly, I just wanted to say thank you for your point of view and trying to help other lawyers lead a more balanced life when they can.
Oh, thank you, Tom. I appreciate that.
So our topic today, diversity and gender bias in the legal profession. I definitely want to get into that with you, and there's a lot to discuss. In fact, it's kind of unfair, I know, because we could talk for hours about those subjects. But first, I wanted to start with you. If you could tell us more about you, like where did you grow up, for example?
Sure. So I was born in Korea, and I came over to the U.S. with my family when I was 10 years old, and I lived in New York City until I went away to college to University of Buffalo. I also went there for law school, and I started my legal career as an assistant state attorney in Tampa, Florida, where I handled misdemeanors and domestic violence cases for a bunch of years. And then I moved to the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, where I started a bankruptcy law practice with my husband, which I still am a part of.
So when you were a kid, is becoming a lawyer something that you wanted to do? Was that a dream, or did it come up later?
It was, but it was such a naive sort of understanding of what being a lawyer was. So I came over to the U.S. when I was 10, and none of us spoke any English. And I remember watching a lot of Law and Order, and it's part of how I sort of learned about the culture and learned to speak English, actually. And I remember watching those shows and thinking, oh, if I can just become a prosecutor, I can sort of, right all the wrongs in the world, of course, very neatly in 1 hour, because, all the jury verdicts come back, always for the right party within an hour. And I thought,
Right.
I'd like to be a lawyer, because as an immigrant, we just ended up, experiencing a lot of hardships and some level of discrimination and, I guess some level of bias as well. And so I really just felt like if I can just be a prosecutor, I can really sort of do the right thing in the world, which, like I said, it was a very naive understanding of how the legal system works.
It just so happens that my youngest daughter is 10, and when you were just saying what you were saying, I was thinking, if we had to move to a different country, how that would be, especially a country where the language is different and have to get up, you know, to get used to that and learn a different culture and all that. How was that for you? I mean, was it a difficult transition? Was it easier? Did the people, the schools make it easier, or what was your experience of that?
It was hard. It was hard just adapting to a different culture, different food, different people. Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't an easy transition, but I think just being 10, like you're still pretty malleable, and so I
Mm.
think I had a much easier time adapting than, let's say my parents, who still to this day, I think struggle on many levels.
Okay. So let's talk about diversity and gender bias. I guess the first thing, being lawyers, we want to define our terms and try to understand what it is um, we're talking about. So when people talk about diversity, what do you have in mind? Like, what are your thoughts about that and gender bias?
Yeah, so I think about diversity in terms of diversity and inclusion. So having a workplace or, I guess it could be like organizations as well, for example, bar associations, where everyone feels welcome, right, regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, sexual preferences, their abilities or disabilities, really creating a place where everyone can feel like they belong.
Okay. Do you think some people feel unwelcome?
I think it's not because there's any intention of having people feel not welcomed, right? But it could be very unintentional. I think this is what often happens. So, for example, I now travel across the country and I talk a lot about wellness and well-being and mindfulness and things like that. And it's not unusual for me to be the only person of color on a very long list of speakers list, right? And very similarly, when I go to a lot of these conferences, it's not unusual for me to not see any people of color or Asians, more specifically, on the speakers list. And there is this feeling like, oh, maybe I don't belong here because I don't see someone that I'm not reflected either in the speakers or even in the audience. So it's just that sense of like not belonging, not because somebody said, well, we don't want Asians here, right? Like that wouldn't happen, but it's that feeling of not belonging because everybody else looks the same and you feel like an outsider. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Um, and gender bias, is it kind of the same, or is there something different about how gender bias plays out in the world than
Um,
diversity?
as Yeah, so I think about gender bias and diversity and inclusion as sort of being related, but in different buckets. So when I talk about gender bias, basically these are patterns, either as individuals or as an institution that we have that sort of stereotypes women um, and we put different expectations on women than we do for men. So, there's lots of studies that talk about gender bias, and typically it falls into these different patterns. So, one pattern might be this idea of having to sort of prove things over and over and over again, more so than her male counterpart. There's all kinds of research about interruptions, right? So women are interrupted at a much higher rate in a meeting than a man, or idea stealing, where women will say something and then everyone sort of glosses over it. 10 minutes later, a man in the room says the exact same thing and then everybody praises him for his great ideas. And I think women also sort of experience other gender bias, like the maternal wall might be another example where mothers are assumed to be sort of uncommitted to their jobs or in some instances incompetent. And and there's like other types of patterns that just make it difficult for women to excel and climb the ladders at their jobs. And then of course we all are familiar with that concept of the glass ceiling as well, which is part of the gender bias.
Definitely. And I have to admit for myself, I'm becoming more and more aware of a lot of these things, some of which you talked about. Another one is just this kind of innate tension that shouldn't be there, but it is sometimes, where when a woman is speaking about something, um, there's and I guess we saw this play out with some conversations in Congress, um, but there's a tension between having a point of view and speaking your mind, whereas on the other side, there's this expectation of being nice about it, you know,
Yep.
about
Yep.
about being this, but being aggressive, having a point of view, but still being a caring, warm nurturer, and so that seems very unfair to me.
Yeah, that we should be likable. And again, there's a lot of studies that show women and men can say the exact same thing in the exact same tone. Like they've literally had people read the exact same script, right? And one in women's voice and one in man's voice. And the listener, whether it's a male or a female, will perceive the woman as being less likable or being more hostile. And there's other words that we can use to describe her behavior that's
Mhm.
typically sort of framed, whereas man gets a pat on the back because he's being more assertive or aggressive. So yeah, it's that like Goldilocks dilemma, right? You have to be assertive but not too assertive. You have to be nice but not too nice, and it's this, and so we end up having to sort of contort ourselves to try to fit into this very, very narrow path. And whereas a male doesn't necessarily have that dilemma.
Especially when the listener is, I mean, who knows who the listener is, right? They could be all over the spectrum in terms of what their perception of being nice and caring is. So like you can't, you're gonna upset somebody, just like I guess with everything. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so let's talk a little bit about examples, just to kind of make it more concrete. So with diversity, like I guess with a lack of it, you had mentioned conferences and the speaker makeup at a conference. Are there other examples that you've experienced or seen in the legal industry broadly, where there's a lack of diversity?
Uh, sure. I mean, I think certainly in the big law. I mean, there's the data is very clear that it's still very much dominated by white male, especially on the equity level partner or management positions. And there's a leak where we're recruiting women at around the same rate as men going into big law, but that after about that 4 to 5 year mark, right around the time where you're kind of being considered for a partnership, we tend to have a lot of attrition in terms of losing women and people of color in big law firms, which of course then has kind of makes up that lack of diversity on the management end of it, or on the equity partner, or just partners in general.
Mhm. Um, and and in terms of gender bias, are there any other examples that you'd want to point out?
Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation on Twitter about this, I guess, a few weeks ago.
Okay.
And I've often been mistaken in courtrooms for either being the Asian language interpreter, or being the assistant or the secretary. And it was just really interesting because I think every woman that was part of this Twitter conversation said something very, very similar. Or for Black male attorneys, they actually said, I've been mistaken for a defendant, which I think often happens as well. There's it's lawyer Brian Stevenson, who wrote this amazing book called Just Mercy, and he's, I think, argued 7 times in front of the Supreme Court, and he writes very eloquently in his book about, just standing around in the courtroom waiting for the judge to take the bench, and the judge takes the bench and yells at him and says, "Where's your lawyer?" And he's like,
Wow.
"Your Honor, I am the lawyer." And the judge sort of laughs, and then Brian Stevenson has this sense of like, oh, I have to sort of laugh along because I don't want the judge to be offended and therefore somehow ruled negatively against my client. So, I
Right.
think these are all sort of racial bias or gender bias. And I think a lot of these are implicit, right? So it might not even be conscious. I'm sure the judge didn't think, oh, he's black, and I'm going to say this because it's just a lot of these are implicit biases.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the it seems like a stumbling block with conversations about diversity and inclusion, because it almost immediately, you know, there's a rush to defense, right? And the defense is, well, I didn't, that wasn't intentional. Um,
Mhm.
how how do we get at that? Like how is it possible to, because kind of by definition, if it's unintentional and it's not something that's really thought through, how do we get at that and change it for the better?
Yeah, and I think this is one of those hot topics right now, right? Whether implicit biases can actually be fixed or addressed, and it seems like there's arguments on both sides that because it's implicit, that there's no way to kind of get at it. And there's also this interesting body of research that's coming out that's suggesting that practicing mindfulness can help you to be more self-aware. And to me, that makes perfect sense because when we're practicing mindfulness, we're actually slowing things down and actually looking at our behaviors. And so just having that moment of pause between whatever you see, right, and whatever your reaction is going to be, then allows you to have a choice in the matter. There's also a really interesting test, and for the listeners out there, you can just Google. It's called Project Implicit from Harvard Education, and you can go in and test and see if you have different implicit biases. And I took the test, and I was kind of surprised that I had implicit bias as well. So I guess that's also kind of worth mentioning that I think probably most of us have implicit biases. And in fact, I know everybody has an implicit bias, right? Like, why do you prefer chocolate ice cream versus vanilla ice cream? Well, we have
Yeah.
a bias towards that particular flavor of ice cream. It's just we want to bring these biases up to the surface. So like I said, we can actually make a more conscious or a more decision based out of awareness.
I'd love to check that out. Where is it again? That questionnaire?
It's implicit. It's implicit.harvard.edu, and I'm looking at the site right now, so you can test your implicit bias around Arab Muslims, race, gender, sexuality, age, weight, Native Americans, disability, Asians, skin tones, religion. So it's a really interesting test,
Wow.
and I think even taking a test like that and just seeing, and it tells you whether you have no bias or if you have a favorable view of that particular group of people or very favorable, or if you have some bias or a very strong bias. So I think it can kind of give you a sense or, kind of hold a mirror up to a bias that you may have that you may not even be aware of.
Well, I think kudos to whoever came up with those questions, because especially if somebody is going to a questionnaire to answer questions about bias, they're going to see, like they're going to see those questions coming from a mile away. So they had to put them together in a very subtle way to get at that, and get
Yeah,
some.
the implicit Harvard test is actually a really interesting test because basically what it shows is that we all have these implicit bias, and we categorize things as something being good or something being bad. So So the test is sort of designed to test like almost your subconscious. So you'll get words like, happy, and then you of course would, and it's like, if it's like happy, if you associate that word as being good, then you push a button on the right. And then if you think of the word like evil, then you would click bad. So you do good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. And then it'll actually start to have like pictures of people of different skin tones. And you have to then say good, bad, good, bad. And it's almost like designed. It's not like asking
Hmm.
you, well, do you have favorable or unfavorable ideas about people of color? Because of course everyone would say, well, I don't. So it's
Right.
really designed to test the implicit bias.
So earlier you mentioned as one way of um, trying to get at implicit bias, mindfulness, and I know
Yeah.
you've written the book on it. So can you tell me a little bit more about what is that? Like what is mindfulness?
Yeah, so mindfulness means to be in the present moment without preference and judgment. I often think about being mindful as paying attention to what is actually happening in the moment with this attitude or this like sort of bringing your most compassionate self into the picture. So we can pay attention to something and put all of our focus on it, but I'm sure you've had this experience where you're paying attention to something because you're like super irritated, right? So you're coming at it with this tone of irritation, and that's going to sort of tarnish, or that's going to filter how you view that particular situation. So, actually coming with this attitude of empathy, curiosity, compassion to whatever the situation may be.
All right. Well, I guess I mean everyone knows that there's been quite a bit of uh, energy in the air related to these topics recently, and I'm just curious. Have you yourself noticed a change in the tenor of discussion about diversity and gender bias in the last year?
It's interesting. I've been practicing law for 14 years, and I feel like diversity and inclusion has been a hot topic for all of those 14 years. And it
Yeah.
seems like every year, we do the study that shows, oh, we're not making a whole lot of forward progress on diversity and inclusion. And then the next year, the same thing happens, and the next year, the same thing happens. And all of these companies are trying to, implement different programs to increase diversity and inclusion. Um, but it doesn't seem like any one of them are particularly that successful. I mean, and I just say that in the sense that I don't think there's any, let's say, M100 law firm that have gender balance, for example, and especially on the partner level. So yeah, and then I don't know, and I think maybe these conversations have become more heated, just more recently, just because of our political landscape right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
All right. And so one thing you hit on with law firms, and I think this is lawyers in general, because we, you know, when we deal with any problem, uh, we try to approach it, or I guess the stereotype is we try to approach it from a very logical, analytical point of view. And so one thing that comes of that I've seen very often are policies, right? Oh, well, we need to come up with a
Hmm.
policy for this. How, I mean, do policies help at all? And do do they help to promote actions rather than words? What has been your experience with that?
I think it's much easier to come up with policies and have a written document that says we care about diversity and inclusion. Much harder to take actions, right? So if you're sitting around, let's say at a partners meeting, and you notice there's no one of color, is someone in that room going to be brave enough to point that out and say, hey, we have a problem here?
Mm.
Or if you're sitting around a room and there's no woman, a woman speaker, woman, partner at the table, is someone going to be brave enough to actually point that out? And so, I think most law firms now have some sort of statement on inclusion, diversity, and inclusion. I don't know that, and it's hard, because I think there is, I want to just make it very. I want to just say that people just innately feel most comfortable with people that look like them, that talk like them, that have similar backgrounds, right? It's that sense of belonging. So it may be difficult, especially if you weren't sort of raised in a very diverse environment to, associate with people that are very different from you.
Well, okay, so let me ask you a question from kind of from the devil's advocate standpoint, or like another point of view. Like I know that some people might ask, like, well, how does it help? Like people that sometimes look at the bottom line, right? Is it
Yep.
is
Yeah.
diversity
And
is I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, is inclusion and the elimination of gender bias good for business? Like, does it add to the bottom line, or doesn't it?
Yeah, so diversity on all levels, right? I mean, I think often when we talk about diversity, we focus on either race or gender, but just having diversity across the spectrum, there's so many studies that show that diversity and inclusion, having a more diverse workplace, is better for the bottom line, and the reason is because it brings people with different backgrounds, with different ways of looking at a problem, right? So they're going to have different ideas about how to solve this particular problem versus if you have, let's say all Stanford law graduate who are all white male, because they're going to look at the world with a very specific prism. And I will also say that a lot of the studies that show that diverse groups actually perform much better, but there's also studies that show that diverse groups also experience more conflict, which also makes sense, right? Because if everyone sitting around the room basically says, oh yeah, that's a great idea, let's just go with that because that's sort of the one way that they've always solved problems, then that creates a more of a harmonious group or atmosphere versus if you have 10 very, very diverse people who all have very different ways of solving a problem, there's going to be more of a dispute or let's say a conversation about how to best solve the problem. But it's exactly that, right? It's exactly that sort of having everybody bring different point of views and actually having to talk through it and consider every idea that makes the team really, really strong and allows for the best ideas to bubble up.
And when I hear you say that, it seems like that should be something that's natural to lawyers, right? Because we're trained to argue and to, when we litigate, have two opposite points of view battling, for which is the better idea. And so you would think that within the workplace context, um, that would be a way we would approach things, is to have diverse points of view.
Yeah, and I think that there can be many, many different strategies and many, many different ways of solving a particular legal issue or problem. And some of it may be tainted by our backgrounds, or even the way that we communicate with clients may be very, very different because of our background, right? And so I think as lawyers, we like to think about things as being very binary, but that there's many, many different shades of gray, and that's really what we want to actually try to foster more of, that there isn't just one particular strategy that is the best strategy.
So in terms of those strategies, what can lawyers and law firms do to improve diversity and gender equality? Like, what are a few things that you would recommend to them to try to focus on and work on to actually improve things, not just come up with a policy?
Yeah, I think on an individual level, just kind of look around at your social circle. So I did this. I read an article um, about having diversity in like the people that you follow on Twitter, and once I read that, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I actually looked back and looked at my Twitter followers, and it wasn't very diverse, and I was actually kind of surprised. So I actually, made a point to follow, lots of different people with lots of different ideas, a lot of ideas that I necessarily may not agree with. And so I think that's one way that we can all increase diversity in our, what we can do as individuals, right? Is just, and that's a fairly simple thing that you can do is just look at your Twitter feed and say, okay, do I have diversity in my Twitter feed? And if you're just following all, let's say, other white people, you might say, oh, I want to try to have more of a varying points of view. So that's one simple, and there's, I think if you just Google something like gender diversity on Twitter followers, you can actually get a breakdown of percentages of women versus men that you follow on Twitter. I haven't been able to find one for a race, but that would be kind of a cool thing to do. And also, I think as you sort of move about your day, right? If you're sitting in a meeting at a law firm, or if you're on a planning committee for a function at a bar association, just actually looking around the room and saying, is this group diverse? Are we actually being inclusive, or does everybody else in this room look like carbon copies of me? I think often, like I said, there's this sense like we like to hang out with people that look like us, that talk like us, and then so we just kind of go out and attract those people. And the other thing that I want to just kind of caution against, and I've seen this sort of happen over and over and over again, is typically in conference settings, you'll have, let's say, 10 organizers, and they'll say, oh, okay, well, we have like 9 white organizers, so we need to get one person of color. And then that person is then sort of charged with bringing diversity and inclusion to the conference. Then that person sort of gets blamed if that doesn't work. And that strategy is just proven to fail, right? Because diversity and inclusion requires everyone's efforts. Like it really does require everyone to be just more mindful about who am I reaching out to, and if I'm just reaching out to my immediate circle of friends and inviting them to speak, for example, is that group diverse? And often it's not going to be. So then you may actually have to, kind of look out, sort of tap into maybe your third or fourth level of connections to find people that are going to be different from you, that's going to bring different perspectives to the conference.
Yeah, it seems like everyone should be involved, right? Everyone should be
Right.
involved in being inclusive, because I think that's what inclusivity is about.
Yeah,
Delegating it to one person.
exactly. Yeah, and I've seen some amazing examples of, like, especially in the tech industry, of CEOs basically, there was one instance at South by Southwest where it was like, I can't remember exactly what the topic was, but it was literally like 9 white male lawyers sitting on the panel, and the one guy actually said, like, I'm just noticing that there's a lack of diversity and inclusion here, and I happen to know that amazing woman sitting in the front row would actually be a much better speaker for this panel than I would. So he gave up his seat for her, and it made like big news, and everyone
Wow.
kind of like went crazy over it. But I think there is that it takes courage, I think, to say like, hey, we have a problem here, right? And I'll often do this is when I'm invited to speak, I'll ask them like, who are the other speakers, and I'll just look them up, and I'll like very kindly email them and say, diversity and inclusion is really important to me, and I notice you only have 10% women speakers, or that you only have 1 out of 80 people that are of color, or you have no one that's a person of color when you have 80 speakers. And oftentimes the organizers actually really appreciative, because they're just not aware, right? It's not anything they're doing consciously. It's an implicit bias. So they'll say, oh my gosh, you're right, that is a problem. And often they'll kind of, scramble to go out and find other speakers.
So for the lawyers and law firms that are hearing this and they really do want to improve, are there any resources out there that they can turn to help them?
Yeah, I think the implicit test that I already talked about is a really good resource. Let's see, there's a really good website called, one second, I can look this up. Yeah, I mean, I think if you just just Google, like diversity and inclusion projects, there's probably at least 100 different projects out there that are all sort of trying to help people create a more inclusive environment. There's one called Project Include, that's really good. There's actually a startup here in San Francisco called Paradigm, and Paradigm is actually going into companies and helping them come up with strategic plans to increase diversity and inclusion. And what's interesting about Paradigm is that everything they do is measured. I think that's also really, really important. And I want to emphasize that it's not just enough to say we want to have more diversity and inclusion. Well, that's really nice, but you really need data behind it. So actually collecting data. There's also a consulting company called August, and they don't necessarily work with people or companies on increasing diversity and inclusion, but they are really mindful and thoughtful about creating the most diverse team possible. And they actually have a really great survey, because I think that's another area where it can be a little bit tricky to ask people to sort of self-identify and say, how do you identify yourself as race? And I think they have a really great way of framing. So rather than saying, check one of these boxes, I think the way they phrase it is like, with what ethnicity do you most strongly identify yourself as? Because someone might not present as, Asian or Black or Muslim or whatever it may be, right? But they self-identify as being Black or whatever that group might be. So I think they have a really great example of surveys that you can administer, within your organization to get a feel for your makeup.
Well, those are some really great resources. Thank you for that. Do you think we'll ever realize this vision of the country and Martin Luther King's vision of equality? Do you think that that's something that's achievable?
I think so, and it will happen. Like it's not a question of whether it's going to happen. It will happen because we know from the data that the makeup of the United States is becoming more and more diverse. And there's a Pew Research that says something like by 2040, we're not going to have any majority race in the United States. So and I think this is something that's really important for companies to think about, right? Because in the next couple of decades, like white, in that very generic use of the word, will no longer be the majority. And so if you're only tailoring to that, to that group of people, and if you're only hiring from that pool, I think I think it's questionable whether your company is going to be as successful as it possibly can be. And I think that's one of the perhaps more compelling reasons for why you need a diverse workforce.
Definitely. Well, thank you, Gina. I loved getting to know you better and learn more about the challenges that we have with achieving true diversity and gender equality and why it's important and some ways of implementing changes to make it a reality.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
Fantastic. I like to ask sort of a off the beaten path question at the end. And so I wanted to ask you, what's a place on your bucket list that you've never visited that you'd like to and why? Is there some place that you haven't gone
India.
yet?
Yeah, India. I love going on meditation retreats. It's one of my I love having that quiet and being able to unplug. But all the retreats, meditations retreats I've gone to has been in the U.S., and I'd love to just go sort of to the motherland of where mindfulness and meditation sort of originated from, and yeah, and just go. And I just imagine myself on like some very isolated meditation center somewhere in India, and just being like truly disconnected and unplugged and in a very, very different environment. So that's where I would love to go.
That sounds amazing. Like I would love to do that too. Be unplugged for once. um, so Gina, I just want to thank you again for sharing your time and thoughts. How can our audience keep in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm very active on Twitter. It's Gina, JEENA_CHO. They can also visit my website, theanxiouslawyer.com, or if anyone wants to drop me an email, my email address is smile@theanxiouslawyer.com.
Great. And if we have questions, I'll forward them on to you, and they can keep in touch with you, as you just said.
Yeah,
And
I would love that.
cool. So thank you all for attending our teleconference today, Diversity and Gender Bias in the Legal Profession with Gina Cho. Again, this is Tom Martin. I just want to thank GLSA for sponsoring. Remember, joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. Check us out at glsaonline.org. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.